Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Aditya here. In today's video, we are diving into how you can leverage the OpenAPI specification with AWS API Gateway. We will also explore how to set up request validation to ensure your API only processes valid requests. So, if you are ready to enhance your API development process, let's get started. First, let's talk about OpenAPI specification. OpenAPI is a widely used and adopted standard for defining REST APIs using a common format. So it's a common way of defining your REST APIs using API definition as code. Okay, so which can be written in YAML or JSON. So this approach allows you to define your API as code, which makes it easier to manage, share, and deploy. Obviously, since right you define your API as code simply, then you can able to easily share that code to other developers. They can easily replicate your API in their ecosystem. That was the advantage of this OpenAPI spec. Okay, and with respect to API gateway, we'll see how to import or importing OpenAPI specification to API gateway. Okay, so one of the powerful features of API gateway is the ability to import an existing OpenAPI specification. So in the API gateway, you can able to import existing OpenAPI specification. And once you imported that specification, right, what API gateway will do is it will automatically sets the following things. Those are, it will set up a method, and it will set up a method request, it will set up integration request, and it will set up method response. So if your API spec, your open API spec or specification contains all this information as a YAML file or JSON file, right, it will automatically set up all these things to you. So you can replicate a number of times this API, right? And additionally, right, AWS extends the open API specification with custom options. So the good thing is here, AWS extends the open API specification, and you can add some custom options here in your open API specification. So, right, you can configure API gateway related things which are specific to API gateway related things, so that it will enable you to configure every single aspect of your API directly within the spec. So you want to create a API within API gateway, right? And if you define your open API specifications with all these things, and also you can able to provide API specific, sorry, AWS specific extension for configuration like stage variables and different AWS related extensions. If you able to add an open API specification, right, it will create or set up exact API in your API gateway without doing any extra work in the API gateway, extra manual work, right? You can directly import that specification. That's it. So that was the advantage of importing OpenAPI specification to API gateway. And the other one is exporting OpenAPI specification from API gateway. Since you have already created one API and you want to share that API to other developers, or you want to manage it, right? So in that case, this will be very useful. And did you know that you can also export your existing API as OpenAPI specification? And this is super useful if you want to document your API or share it with other developers. Obviously, right? By exporting the specification, you can easily keep your API definition in sync with actual implementation. So here you can able to see these 2 points. Finally, I can summarize like you can export your current API to API specification so that you can useful for your documentation and sharing. Right. And moving on to the next topic, that is SDK generation with OpenAPI. So another great benefit of using OpenAPI is ability to generate SDKs for your applications. So you can use OpenAPI to generate SDK for various programming languages like Python, Java, JavaScript. So if you have SDK, you don't need that API documentation and all, right? You just use the SDK and directly connect to the API you want. So that once your API is defined, right, in OpenAPI, you can generate client SDKs in various programming languages, and which helps developers or clients to integrate your API more easily into their apps. So it simplifies clients integration, obviously. So clients no need to do that hassle, or developers no need to do that hassle of finding out your API documentation and do the coding and all. You provide SDK to them, so they will usually integrate that SDK into their workflow. It will simplify that. And that was the advantage of using the OpenAPI specifications. I hope you understand about the OpenAPI specifications advantages, and I'm moving on to the next topic, that is REST API, request validation overview. At the start of this topic, I mentioned two things. One is OpenAPI specification, which is completed. Now we came to request validation overview. Okay, so moving on to request validation, right? API Gateway allows you to configure basic validation of API requests before they proceed to the integration request. Okay, so you know the integration request, right? So before going to integration request itself, we can do some request validations, basic validations. So that can be enabled in our REST API, or sorry, API gateway, by using API gateway. And this validation ensures that only properly formatted requests reach your backend. That means it will reduce unnecessary backend calls, definitely, right? It will only send properly formatted requests, and which will prevent unnecessary load and improve security also. And the good thing is, if any request fails, right? If any requests are not in proper format, immediately we will get 400 error response in validation failure. So before going to integration request itself, you are doing some basic validation, right? It is not hitting the backend. So that was one advantage of using this request validation. And we'll see, right, how this request validation works. So when request validation is enabled, what and all checks the request validation will do, we'll see now, right? First, it will check the parameters in the URL or URI, and the query string and the headers are present or non-blank. That means in the URI, whether you sent proper query strings, proper header parameters, which are properly included or not, which are not supposed to be blank, right? That check it will ensures. And the second one is the request payload adheres to the configured JSON schema request model. That means whatever the request we are sending, right, it has to match with the JSON schema which we provided to the API gateway. So if we provide a request schema, for example, I need to have this particular query string, for example, XYZ query string, and also I need API key in the request. So if those two are missing in the payload, but in the schema we are mentioned about those two keys, then definitely it will fails. The validation will fails, right? So if request validation fails, right, API gateway immediately responds with 400 error. As I explained in the previous slide, it will immediately respond with 400 error. This not only improves the reliability, this not only improves the reliability of your API, but also reduces load on your backend servers. Definitely, right? You are not sending your request to integration request, and integration request is not sending to backend. At the starting itself, you are doing this basic validation, which is definitely required. And that validation is fails, right? You are not writing the custom logic in your backend also. You are minimized or reduced all the backend calls here. So load on the backend here. Okay, that is the advantage of using the request validation. And we'll see the steps how to set up request validation with OpenAPI. Okay, so you can easily set up request validation by importing OpenAPI definition file. So first thing you have to do is you have to import OpenAPI definition file. Okay, and after that what you have to do is you have to define validators. So validators for your API methods. And after that you need to enable param only validator for all API methods. For example, you want to add this basic validation only for all API methods, then you can enable this param only validator. Otherwise, you have one thing called all inclusive validator. So for more comprehensive validation, which can be applied selectively, for example, a post method. So if you use this all inclusive validator, right, for specific methods. So here you are going very granular, for each post method or for each get method, like that you for each method you have to select and apply this all inclusive, so that for that particular method only validation will be applied, but params only will get applied to all the API methods. Okay, for better clarity, look at this particular example. Here we have one key called this is OpenAPI specification. In this OpenAPI specification, we have a key called X hyphen Amazon hyphen API Gateway hyphen request validators. So in this request validators, we provided one thing called all, where we are saying validate request body. So request body should not be non-null, and validate request parameters also. And we have one thing called params only. Here, right? Validate request body. So params also we are checking, and validate request parameters. So these are the two things you can able to enable. Otherwise, you can enable like this also, simply X Amazon hyphen API gateway hyphen request hyphen validator params only. So params only, what it will do, it will add validator to all API methods. Otherwise, you can specify paths. Inside paths, you can specify for a particular endpoint with the method. For example, slash validation post method, you are enabling that validation. You are not enabling for all the methods. You are specifically selected one method here. So likewise, you can enable request validation with OpenAPI specification, right? And the advantage here is you are validating the request, not sending to the backend itself. And you have very low latency now, and you achieved very low latency. You achieved low latency, and you reduced load on the backend. Okay. So finally, using the Open API specification with API gateway and enabling the request validation can significantly enhance your API's robustness and ease of integration. Definitely, right? Whether you are importing an existing specification or exporting your API or setting up validation rules, these tools make your API development process smoother and more efficient. Okay, I hope you understand about OpenAPI specification and request validation in depth, and we'll meet in the hands-on. So in this session, what we are going to do is we're going to see how OpenAPI specifications work in API Gateway. For that, first what we need to do is we need to open API Gateway service. So I'm opening API Gateway AWS service, and it's opening. So this is our existing APIs, right? So before touching these APIs, first thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an API. So for that, right click on this create API, and this process you already know. We have gone through this iteration so many times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a REST API here. So for creation of REST API, what I have to do is I have to click on build here. So I'm clicking build. So once I click on build, I got this page called create REST API page where we have to give some details. So here I'm giving my REST API details like my API. But before creating API like this, right? New API, we'll do one thing. We have import API option. Here, if you have any OpenAPI file or OpenAPI specification file, you can import that. You can import that OpenAPI specification so that it will create your API gateway, right? But I don't have any OpenAPI specification file, so I'm not doing that. But I'm going to use this example API. So this is nothing but this is also API spec only, but this is Swagger. So there are two types of specifications available in this API gateway. One is the Swagger and another one is OpenAPI gateway. So even OpenAPI spec or Swagger will look like this. So even you write in YAML files also, right? So it's defined your API, right? As a code here. You can see, right? It defined all the methods and all different kind of endpoints and integrations and all. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create this API. That's it. So if you have your OpenAPI spec, you can create your API like this. Look, the whole get methods inside the option method, post method, right? You have to pass this pet ID, and also you will have this get and option method under this resource, right? What you did, you used that OpenAPI specification or Swagger specification. You created your whole API by using that, right? Fascinating, right? And the second option is, or second point is, right? You understand now how to create your own API by importing, or how to create a API in API Gateway by importing OpenAPI specification or Swagger specification. And the second thing is how to export this API. For example, go back to your APIs. For example, I have this my integration test API. I'm opening that. So I want to export this my integration test API. I want to share it to other developers to replicate that. So for that, what I have to do is we have this. Once you open the API, you have this API actions. So in the API actions, you will have import API and delete API. But one thing, if you go to the stages, right, you can able to do that. And seems like this API we didn't created any stages. We'll go back to the some deployed stage. For example, this stage you take and we go to stages and you can export a stage. So in this stage action, right, if you come to stages, the stage actions you will have one option called export, and in the exporting you will have two options now, even OpenAPI 3 or Swagger. So whatever specification you are interested in, you can select that. And even OpenAPI's specification is giving more AWS related extensions to you, and Swagger is a generic API specification. And even you can select the format, whether you want JSON format or YAML format, and you can able to specify export with extension, or if you are not going to use with API gateway, then export without extension. But if you want to use this specification in another AWS account, then export with AWS API gateway extension will be helpful for you. And even you can export with Postman extensions also. This is very fascinating, no? You can export in two different types of API specifications here. And we have discussed about only Open API specification. But that is fine, right? You can able to export your API and you can easily manage them, share them, and document them. Fascinating. And this is all about the exporting, and I will show how to export, right? I will select OpenAPI, YAML, and export API. And if I click here, right, API got exported. So I'm going to that file now, and I will open that. And if you see, this is my OpenAPI specification for my API. Simple. Okay. And I'm going back to my AWS console, and here we have already seen how to export our API. And one more thing is, by using this API you can generate SDKs also. How can you do that? In the stage actions, if you click, you will have this option called generate SDK, and here you can able to select the platform you want. For example, you want this API to be used in some Android development or JavaScript development or Java SDK. You can select that, and if you select Java SDK, it will ask different options. You have to provide those options. Since if you are Java developer, you will know about this package name, build system, group ID, artifact ID. You will aware that. And if you are not in Java developer, right, you can, or if you don't want for the Java SDK, you can select JDK SDK also, and click on generate SDK. It will generate you in the software development kit to you. By using this software development kit, you can able to access your API, right? You don't need to write code from the scratch. That was one more advantage of using this OpenAPI specification, and API Gateway provides these two options like exporting, importing, and generating SDKs. Okay, and when it comes to request validation, so we'll go to the resources. We'll see how can we add the request validation. So as we discussed before sending to integration request itself, we are going to add that request validation that is here in the method request. So in the method request settings, if you observe, right, you will have this authorization setting and request validator setting. Okay. Even if you need API key also, here you can turn on. So click on edit here and see how can you add that request validation. So if you want authorization, you can specify AWS IAM users only can able to authorize this, otherwise keep it none. And the other one is the request validator. This is what we're interested, right? So here you can mention validate only body. So whether body has the proper parameters which are non-blank, or validate body core strings and headers also. You can validate basic validation you can do, or validate only core strings and headers. So these are all options you have, and you will give some operation names, right? And this thing you can configure in your OpenAPI specification code also, and here also. So likewise, you can add the basic validation to your request before sending to the integration request to minimize the backend load. Okay, so yeah, so that's about the OpenAPI spec with API gateway and also how request validation works. And you have seen in the hands-on where and all options available for you and how to enable them also. So you can give it a try. For example, if I click on validate body and click on save, we'll see how the response we will get. Right? Go to test and click on test, and we are getting proper response. Okay, because we are using proxy integration, it is sending the proper request and response, so that is fine. So likewise you can add the basic validations here. Okay, so I'm reverting it back. So I hope you understand the hands-on session, and I hope you understand how to configure these things. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like, share and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out more AWS tips and tricks. See you next time. Bye.